He Sees You. Written by Michael Marks. Performed by Jeff Clement. She walked up to me, bright-eyed and smiling, as I stood in the crowd waiting for the train. Her mouth was moving, but what she said was a mystery. The misfits blasted through my headphones, a ritual of mine intended to mask the noise of the busy commuter trains. "Excuse me?" I pulled the headphones from my ears and raised an eyebrow at her. "He sees you." The girl's eyes locked with mine, wide open and dilated to the point that her pupil seemed to swallow her iris. What? I gave her my best, "What are you on?" look. "He sees you. He wants you," she said matter-of-factly. The smile never wavered from her face. The small blonde girl was starting to creep me out big time. My first assumption was that she was drugged out of her mind, but she didn't look like the typical druggie. The girl wore a cleanly pressed red suit, the skirt hemmed just above the knee. She was draped with diamond jewelry and wore a haircut that probably cost more than my education. Who sees me?" I pressed. Maybe it was the way she was dressed, or maybe it was the way she carried herself, but this level of crazy didn't seem to fit the person. I decided to indulge her another minute before I put my headphones back in and returned to my usual "don't engage the crazies" mode. "He sees you." She retained the same strange expression, a smile plastered onto an otherwise emotionless face. I stared at her a few more seconds, waiting for her to elaborate before finally giving up the game. "Okay, lady, time to get back on the meds, or off the drugs, whichever." I shoved my headphones back into my ears and turned away from her dismissively. I was just in time to hear Danzig launch into the chorus of Skulls, and I fell back down into my own little world. It was hardly my first time dealing with some drugged-out nutcase during my nightly commute. Ignoring them was usually the best possible response. At some point, I realized that the girl was still standing exactly where she'd been before. I could see her staring intently at me from the corner of my eye. After another moment, she turned away from me and headed back through the crowd in the direction she'd come from. I shook my head in disbelief at just how whacked out that seemingly put-together lady really was, and turned my music up to deafening levels. A few minutes later, I boarded the train. As per my usual routine, I walked to the last car and went to sit on the top level. As I settled into my seat, I saw the blonde girl walk through the doors into my car. Her two wide eyes fixed on me immediately, and a Looney Tunes smile corrupted her pretty face. I quickly shifted my eyes to look out the window, pretending not to register her presence. But I felt, rather than saw, her climb the stairs. The top level of the train car was nothing but a row of single seats on either side with a railing and a luggage shelf shared by both sides hanging from the ceiling. She went to the opposite side of the car and sat a couple of seats back from where I was. I didn't look, but I swear I could feel her eyes on me the entire time. There were 10 stops between the main station we were pulling out from and my stop in Dentonderry. With each passing of a platform, I would glance behind me very briefly and casually, hoping to see an empty seat where she'd once been. But at each station, I was disappointed. The girl would be there, leaning out of her seat, eyes wide and staring, mouth smiling. She was making me nervous, and I found myself glancing back at her more and more often, and with less subtlety. Her expression never changed, and her eyes never faltered from mine. I became increasingly concerned and unsettled that in a train car this crowded, nobody seemed to notice this psychopath staring me down, or at least no one acknowledged it. The other commuters' eyes were fixed downward, wrapped up in their own little worlds, ignoring my situation entirely. I counted down the stations, growing increasingly panicked the closer I got to my destination. When the train finally slowed down at my station, I bolted from my seat and took the descending steps 2 at a time. The instinct to get away from the stranger was so overwhelming. I'd never felt so uncomfortable in my life. The way she looked at me, it was like she wanted to eat me. I was the first one out the door and into the cool night air. I leapt down the steps of the train station and walked briskly out into the street. I chanced to look back, and when I didn't see the girl following, I slowed down a fraction and took a deep breath, laughing to myself. I pulled the headphones from my ears and took out the cigarettes from my pocket. Lighting a smoke, I watched the train pull away from the station, its whistle echoing and fading as it went on down the line. "Sayonara, psycho," I said aloud and saluted the quickly departing train. It was a 10-minute walk back to my house, and I found myself walking much more quickly than usual that night. I could still feel her eyes on me, and I couldn't get her out-of-place smile and odd mannerisms out of my head. I smoked my cigarette and did my best to forget the whole encounter, ultimately failing, and before I knew it, I was standing at my front porch. The outside light had been broken for a while, and the house stood a dozen yards or so from the street, leaving the area in complete darkness. I shuddered involuntarily. "She's gone," I told myself. "It was just some crazy addict, that's all. Someone else's problem. Just because a meth head can dress herself doesn't mean she's not a couple beers shy of a six-pack." I took one last drag from my cigarette and then flicked it to the pavement, then walked up the stairs to my porch and found myself enveloped in an even deeper darkness. I fumbled in my pocket for my house keys, eventually found them, and then struggled to find the right one. I felt rushed, as if all the evil in the world was suddenly bearing down on me. I nearly broke into an insane sort of laughter, but I found the right key just before the madness overtook me. I pulled open the screen, ready to vault inside and flip on every light in the house. Then I felt a tap on my shoulder and heard the familiar voice of the stranger. "He sees you." Before I could react, she was on me. She wrestled me to the ground with what felt like the strength of a person 3 times her size. I felt all the air leave my lungs as my back connected with the unforgiving surface of my concrete porch. My hands grabbed wildly at her, trying to find purchase as she straddled me, a considerable weight set upon my body. My eyes, which were quickly adjusting to the darkness, took in the familiar 2 wide eyes and 2 animated smile. "He sees you," she repeated. "He wants you." A calm voice, a matter-of-fact voice. The more I tried to push her away, the further she leaned over me. For a girl her size, she was sporting a superhuman strength. Since she'd first attacked, her eyes had somehow grown even wider and whiter, and I found myself staring into the embodiment of pure madness. Her mouth had changed shape for the first time since I had seen her. It opened wide, and her jaw appeared to unhinge like some kind of snake. I screamed for someone, anyone, to help me as I continued to claw at her. And then something came writhing out of the darkness of her wide-open mouth. In pure shock, I shot my hand up under her chin and tried to push her mouth closed. I felt something like tendrils wrap around my wrist, and little traces of slime drip down my arm.
"I see you."
This voice was different from the stranger's. It was guttural and deep. It was the sound of something ancient and dead, and it came not from the woman's mouth, but from inside my own head. This was the end, I thought. In a last, pathetic attempt to save my own life, I took one hand off of her face and searched the bare ground next to me, trying desperately to find my keys. Her gaping maw drew ever closer to me, wider still, threatening to swallow me whole. Just as her upper lip touched my hairline, my fingers happened upon cool, sharp metal. I snatched the keys up and shoved the largest one between my middle and ring finger. With all the strength I had left, I punched the key into the side of her head, and then I did it again. At first, she seemed unfazed, even as I felt drops of her blood drip onto my arms and face from the repeated stab wounds I'd created in her cheek and temple. Then the key found a much softer target, pushed in deep and caught. Her eye. The scream that echoed forth was something shrill and primal. No human could make that sound. Nothing living could make it. She released me and scrambled to her feet, hissing as she cupped her damaged eye. Then, before I could even get to my feet, she vaulted off my porch, clearing the steps in a single jump, and disappeared into the row of elms across the street. I sat up on one elbow, catching my breath and staring at the tree line for God knows how long. I could feel something oozing down my hand and covering my knuckles. The realization that it was fluid from her eye snapped me back to reality, and I got to my feet and into my house as fast as I could. I slammed the door behind me. That night and every night since, I've triple-locked all of my doors and windows. I draw the shades and I keep the lights on at all times of day. The porch light is fixed, and I try to never get home after sundown. The nights when I do find sleep, it's usually thanks to whiskey. I keep a shotgun next to my bed. When I close my eyes, I see her stiff, unnatural smile and her black hole eyes. I don't know what she was or where she went, but I do know one thing. She's still coming for me. This morning, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was only 6 words, but they filled me with more terror than I ever thought I'd feel again. He sees you. He wants you.